us more about that. This is a tilapia with sumac and lemon. And there comes with 2 sauces, a yogurt dill sauce with cucumber, and a parsley and lemon sauce.
Yum.
We also have a chickpea and cucumber salad with feta cheese and red onion and Kalamata olives.
Amazing.
And just some melon cubed up with a honey lemon sauce. Fresh made homemade pita bread with a thyme and olive oil dipping sauce. And what would life be without a lefevre? A little spiced wine, which is a Shiraz with cinnamon and mint. And during the 1st century, wine was often served either cut with water or spiced with a variety of spices, including cumin. I'm not sure what cumin wine would taste like.
You didn't put that in.
I didn't try.
Beautiful.
Here's Adrian, who
Hello there, hi.
Hi, Adrian.
helped make this all possible, and we're in her lovely kitchen.
And it's dark.
And
No
it's dark
lights.
because we have no power.
Went out about 10 minutes ago.
But you made it work.
But everything got cooked right in time.
But I'm glad Jordan was able to join us. That was my major worry.
Well, I can smell your fish and I want to jump through the screen. It looks delicious.
It'll be gone very shortly because we have some people here to share it with.
Well, we're also recording it, so we now got to see everything, which is beautiful.
And now, then what you should do then is turn off your picture.
I'm gonna turn off my video so I can conserve my power, so I hopefully can hear the whole lecture.
Oh, boy. Okay, we better turn it
Yeah,
off now.
so I'm going off video. If anybody has some questions on 1st century foods, the expert is talking after me. Bye-bye.
Bye, Barry.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you, Barry. All right.
So to get the full, okay, so Alyssa, you're doing that. I'm not learning anything.
All right. So we have 15
Hi.
screens.
Hi, Quinn.
Judith Kornblatt, hi. Oh my gosh. I don't know if she hears us. I think her screen is frozen. Or is it...
Yep.
Judith.
Good morning, Phyllis.
Hi, Phyllis.
Judith, you have to unmute here. I'll do it. Judith, can you unmute yourself?
Yeah, I just did. Good morning.
No,
Hey,
Judith.
hi.
Here we go.
Hi.
Hi.
I brought my breakfast beverage.
Beautiful.
Hi, Judith.
The Babylonian rabbis would approve, Judith.
I figure you have to have a carbo with your breakfast, so.
I'm
But it
showing
is
for our future.
definitely cocktail hour.
A little early for me, but
But not where I am.
yeah. You look very happy and awake.
It's
Good
hot.
morning.
You got a ceiling fan on. I do. Yeah. It's we're having it's been the hottest temperature here in recorded history. The recorded history in Israel is 100 years. So, my cat wants to get in the room. Hold on.
This is a year for making history, apparently.
Yeah, not all good.
No. Well, we were out of power this morning at Medical Center, so
Oh.
so we like a little drama. Good morning, Sai.
You're muted.
Whoops, Sai, you have to unmute yourself.
Good, I am now unmuted.
I say.
I am no longer on mute.
Good morning, Cy.
Good morning, Nancy.
Good morning, Livia.
She's all up.
Good morning, everyone.
So did anybody try any of the menu items or look at the recipes and think they wanted to try them?
Excellent.
Let me go with, I'm going to pick on Quinn. Quinn, are you going to try any of those recipes? I know how much you love to cook.
I actually, can you hear me?
Yeah.
Okay. Yeah, that's actually our lunch. The tilapia's thawing. And we went running around and bought it all with our Shabbat stuff. At first, I thought it was Rosenblum's menu, and I was like even more excited. I've taken every class of Rosenblum's I could. But it's not Rosenblum's menu.
Everybody froze up for me.
Hey, Quinn.
Hi, Anna. We miss you. We wave at your house every time we drive by.
I don't live there anymore.
Move?
Which house?
Well, we just wave at Yellowstone.
Oh, that one. Yes, I do live there.
Okay.
Next time, ring the bell.
We actually never go down Yellowstone. We're driving on Mineral Point to get home. But
Got it. Yes, I know. You live just a few minutes from me.
yeah, I want to bring you some potato kugel soon.
I would be delighted to get it. I love it.
Quinn, I'm impressed by your dedication to Professor Rosenblum.
Always.
Yeah, and Quinn, I want to hear more about what you're having for lunch because I think a couple people talked over you while you were telling us that. Did you do the whole menu or just the fish?
We're doing the fish, the bread, the dressing and the sauces for the fish. I think we're doing everything but the melon balls because I didn't know where to find a musk melon, and the only watermelons I could find were these like. God, that's the thunder.
Oh, beautiful thunder.
Just
I
got
won't take
here.
that as divine judgment on my talk, because I haven't talked.
Good.
Cleared up. I'm up in northeast Richland County, and it's cleared. The sun is out.
Yeah, that is not what's happening in Madison right now.
No.
So once
Jordan, it's
again,
a
we
great-
don't know what the divine is saying.
It's a great intro for you, Jordan. It's amazing.
Exactly. So once we get started, we're going to try to put a spotlight video on Jordan, which should work for everybody who's looking on a computer. I'm not sure what spotlight video does if you're looking on an iPad or a phone. If you want to see just Jordan big and the spotlight video thing doesn't work, make sure you're in speaker view and not gallery view. And then everybody else is muted and you'll be able to see Jordan. And that should, although we're also going to show some slides. So we're learning as we go. Be patient. We'll get you what you need. We figure
Are you going to mute
forgiving
us?
audience.
Are you going to mute us all?
Yes.
I'll be muting you all. And
Okay,
again,
thanks,
if for
Deb.
some reason you find that you're not muted, then please, and it's noisy, please do feel free to mute yourself. And then if for some reason I mute everybody and Jordan gets muted in the meantime, I'll probably give him a reminder to unmute. Good morning, Diane Cedar.
Good morning, Deb.
Such a great combo of you guys. I love it. Good morning, Roz.
Good morning. This is Roz. Just a quick question. Jordan, how did you come upon, you're muted, but how did you come upon this subject to talk to us today? Or maybe you'll talk about that later, but.
I could talk about it later, but I could also talk about it now. So I've worked on food for a long time, and then to make a short story long, basically we had our son who this week is turning 6, and the way my brain works is as Val, my wife, and him were figuring out breastfeeding, I thought, I wonder what the rabbis say about breastfeeding, and started reading up on Mishnah and Talmud on that and found it fascinating. And then I thought, I wonder what scholars say about this because it's so interesting, and found out that they were profoundly wrong. They either ignored it and said, a baby's born and when he is 4 or 5, you teach him Torah, which ignores the first 4 or 5 years of everyone's life and then ignores half the population's life thereafter. Or they took all of these fascinating theoretical texts as if they were describing actual things and missing the fascinating theoretical discussion there. So I started to write an article that became a very long article. And the way I ended up laying it out was through themes. And then I was casting about trying to figure out what my next project was, and realized that, and this will connect to something I'll probably say at the beginning, that there are source readers for Introduction to Rabbinic Judaism that'll have the greatest hits of texts. You know, the ones that are their go-to sermons for every rabbi, or basic intro texts. And there are historical texts, but there's no introduction to themes in rabbinic literature. And I realized that I'd written about food, but not beverages. And so I ended up writing this, which is designed to be an introduction to themes in rabbinic literature through that roundabout way.
Awesome. So we are about to hit the 10 o'clock hour. And as just now also tuning in, we are again going to be spotlighting Jordan, and hopefully it'll work on your screen. And Alyssa had said, you know, put yourself in speaker view to help you if for some reason you don't just see him. And then if you have any questions or comments, go ahead to the chat room and type in your questions or comments whenever you please. Alyssa is fielding the questions. And if it's something based on something Jordan just said, she may interrupt him and ask right away, or, you know, we'll field them at the end after the PowerPoint presentation. So otherwise I'm gonna mute everybody so Jordan can mute himself, but also Barry is going to introduce Jordan. But Barry, first let me mute everybody, and then you can unmute yourself. Okay, Barry, you're on.
I think I'm unmuted now. It's with great pleasure that I introduce Jordan Rosenblum, who has all these titles, such as Belzer Professor of Classical Judaism, Max and Frida Weinstein Bascom Professor of Jewish Studies, and Chairman of the Art History Department at the University of Wisconsin-Madison. He received a bachelor's degree from Columbia, and at the same time, a bachelor's from JTS. In 2001, he got his PhD at Brown in 2008. He's been very interested in kashrut and food in ancient Israel. And in 2000, this year has published a book that he's going to speak about today on rabbinic drinking. What beverages teach us about rabbinic literature? And with that, I'll introduce Jordan.
Okay, and I'm going to share the screen, Jordan, so give me just one moment, please.
Sure, thank you for that introduction. Hopefully, I think I answered Phyllis asked a question about the book, and I wrote it there. So first, while that's happening, I want to welcome everyone to my basement. It's very odd still to be hosting things from here. I've leaned in to the whole studio effect of this so that it's better audio quality. So I'm calling this Pandemic Basement Studios. I've even just added a pop filter, so hopefully my P's aren't as grating on your ears. It's hard to do a talk like this in this scenario because I'm used to looking out at people and seeing if they're confused. Quinn mentioned that he's taken many of my classes, and I often would look at an engaged student like Quinn to see if, if he looked confused, I would stop and say, okay, what did I mess up? So I think Alyssa's sort of moderating that, and if something seems like it's irrelevant to the moment, please do just interrupt me and let me know, or we can save some things for the end, but if it's something that's going along, stop me. In some ways, some of this might seem a little intro. So again, feel free to push me further on things. It's hard to know how to pitch this because part of this project is trying to explain why, I mentioned when I was an undergrad at JTS in Columbia, and I just fell in love with Talmud there and fell down a hole that I'm still trying to dig my way out of. And this part of this book was trying to explain that to people. And it was kind of fun because as an academic, you kind of have two registers. You have the register that you talk to your students in, and then you have the register of academic ease, and where you write with using these big words to impress each other of your important readings of nuance of text. And this was a chance to write in my professor voice that I use for my students, to try and explain concepts in Rabbinic Judaism that aren't necessarily explained so easily, because there are things that that either teachers assume you get it. I remember a JTS professor saying, if you haven't studied Aramaic, just treat it like Hebrew with an aleph on the end, and you'll figure it out. And realizing how much was being assumed of my knowledge at that point. But also there were so many times when writing this that I thought I understood something. And we're going to get to one of them towards the end, this concept of machshirin. I thought I understood it until I had to try and explain it in simple English. And I have a good friend in the field, Greg Gardner, who I kept emailing, because I was like, I thought I understood it, and then I confused myself, and then I thought I understood it again, but now I've confused myself again. So can you talk through it with me? And what I actually discovered is that concept, I had to talk to several friends, because all of them thought they understood it until they tried to talk it through it with me, and then they realized that they didn't understand it fully either. So I still am not sure if I fully got it. So with that, maybe we'll skip to the next slide 2. Or can people see that or no?
It's now on.
Okay, awesome. So there's the cover slide in slide 2. There we go. Okay, we start with that. I have a picture of the phoenix there, because the first important thing to realize about rabbinic literature is biblical Judaism is a Judaism of sacrifice, of sacrificing animals in a central location eventually in Jerusalem. And when the first temple falls, it shatters many things, right? If you read Psalm 139, there's this very visceral moment of crying on the rivers of Babylon, not knowing what to do. How do you worship a deity in a specific place when you're no longer in that place? What do you do? And ends with some quite traumatic and troubling language of feeling raw and emotional. And then the temple gets rebuilt, and there's an attempt to get the band back together and get everything back in order. And we'll ignore the Second Temple period much for this moment. It's a fascinating period. I'm happy to talk about it, but I want to jump to my favorite group, the rabbis. Oh, hold on 1 second. I have a coffee delivery. So thank you. And if you want, I'm happy to talk about the history of Jews and coffee later. I'm teaching a Jewish law, business, and ethics course, which Quinn took, and we learn about the history of Jews and coffee, but that's past the Talmud, so we'll talk about it then. And then in 70 CE, Romans destroy the temple. And this is an equally traumatizing ritual moment. And it's out of the ashes, and this is why I have the phoenix. And by the way, in Bereshit Rabbah, the rabbis do show knowledge of the phoenix mythology. But like the phoenix, the rabbis rise from these ashes. Now, the rabbis will talk about and imagine an unbroken chain of history going back to the Bible, but they're very clearly responding to this moment and coalescing post this moment. So the first thing to understand is they're attempting to translate a sacrificial, place-based religion into a non-sacrificial, time-based religion. And one of the ways this comes up, if you turn to slide 3, is the example I give is the Hebrew Bible will talk about, there is an oil lamp up there. And they'll talk about in Exodus that you cannot kindle a fire on the Sabbath, but what can you fire up an Amazon Kindle on the Sabbath? Right? And how do you figure out a way to do that? And so the rabbis create a way to translate that, and their understanding, which I won't explain it too much because I assume most of the audience knows this, is the notion of dual revelation. Torah shebechtav, written Torah, meaning the Hebrew Bible, a bound text, and Torah sheba'al peh, rabbinic tradition, which is an ongoing, unfolding revelation. And this is how you can find principles that say, and the answer will, and this is Quinn can attest to this, I say this too much in class, is often it depends. So can you use an Amazon Kindle on the Sabbath? It depends on who you ask and what principles you work through. And it also depends on what kind of Kindle you're talking about. I have to ask you a series of questions before I can answer it. And you will find different authorities that make different answers based on different principles. And the rabbis work to come up with these categories. So to understand how you get there, I argue that you can use texts about drinking to understand a lot of these principles. So I'm going to give a few of my favorites, chosen for a variety of factors, some just because I like them, some because they seem timely, and some just because they're easier to explain in a short period of time. So I'm going to turn to the first text, so the next slide. And the question I'm going to talk about is about straining wine and brewing beer on intermediate festival days. And this is timely because, right, we have Rosh Hashanah coming up soon, then we have Yom Kippur, and then we have Sukkot. And Sukkot is, the holiday is kind of like a donut, right? There's festival days, whole in between them, these intermediate festival days, and then festival days on the other end. And the rabbis spend a lot of time discussing the festival days in comparison to the Sabbath, and the intermediate days in respect towards the festival days. Because for the rabbis, they're always going to start with the weird, the anomalous. When they hear hoofbeats, they think zebras, not horses. They think of the odd case first. I mentioned, although I won't talk about it, but I'm happy to later, breastfeeding. In the Mishnah tractate that they talk about breast milk, they talk about male breastfeeding and breast milk before they talk about female breastfeeding and breast milk, which is an indication that they're interested in theoretical. Now, that's technically possible, male galactorrhea is possible, but it's far less attested in the medical literature, right? And I think that inversion is telling. So let's start to look at a text. So if we look at the next slide. I just went with English because when you put Hebrew on PowerPoint and you share it or send it to someone else, funky things happen. The Yetzer Hara on the internet sometimes messes things up, so I decided to just stick with English for now. But if you're at home on a computer, you can easily, for example, go to Sefaria and find the Hebrew there, or we can talk about it later. So Rabbi Eliezer says, one may suspend a strainer on a festival day, but not on the Sabbath, and one may put wine through a strainer on the Sabbath, and thus also on a festival day. So they were talking about spiced wine. In our schmooze before, there's stuff in wine and sediment and leak and just gunk. And so you would want to strain it out. But the question is can you do that on the Sabbath or on a festival day? So first they say, okay, you can set up a strainer on the Sabbath, so on the festival day, but not on the Sabbath. But you can put wine through a strainer on the Sabbath. So they're saying if you, before the Sabbath, set up your strainer, you can pour wine through it. So you can have fresh, sediment-free wine, but you can't set it up then. But if it's a festival day, you can set it up. And then on the festival day, you can do both. But the sages say, the anonymous sages who are now going to disagree with the singular interpretation, one might neither suspend a strainer on a festival day, nor put wine through a strainer on the Sabbath. But one may put wine through a strainer on the festival day. So they say, no setting it up on either day, no straining it on the Sabbath, but on a festival day you may. So there's a distinction. So this is what starts in Mishnah Shabbat and what you know. And this deals with the reality of stuff in your wine. Okay, that's where we're going to start the conversation. So now, what is this going to teach us? So let's turn to the next slide and see some interesting things come up. Oh, yeah. I want to look for three interesting features that come up in this text. The concept of a subterfuge, the concept of beer. This gets back to my comment to Judith about her beer, and intermediate festival days. Now, this is in Bavli Shabbat. It's in the Babylonian Talmud, which is written in Babylonia, which is a beer drinking culture. Whereas Mishnah and Palestinian Talmud are written in Roman Palestine, which is a wine drinking culture. They denigrated beer. They thought of it as a lesser beverage. So let's look at this text. And it says, Rabbi Bar Huna said, one may, actually, let me do this one, make sure I see it right. I also have the PowerPoint here. Here. Okay. Rabbi Bar Rav Huna said, one may employ a subterfuge with regard to suspending a strainer on a festival day by using it to hold pomegranates in it. And then once it is already set up, pour wine through it and hold sediment in it. Now, I love this because they're acknowledging with a wink that one may use a subterfuge. And this has a complicated afterlife that will need to be talked about, if we wish, where the negative view eventually becomes, through some anti-Semitic discourse, of Jews as an overly legalistic group who focus on these subtleties to use law as tricky. But from the rabbinic perspective, it's a simple question. Do you violate law or not? And if you violate law, you're violating halakha, you're violating God's commandments. That you don't. But if you don't, then you're not. And so they're coming at from the perspective of that. And also, this was before the internet. This was their fun, right? So the other thing I'm also trying to always communicate to students is they really enjoy this. And this is fun for them. And this is the activity is both a pietistic activity of figuring out, do you violate law or not, and fun. They actually enjoy this. So they say you can use a subterfuge, you can use a trick, but the trick is a legal loophole, right? It means, and what is the trick? So you can't set up a strainer on a festival day, but imagine like a portable colander that you can collapse. Now, if you set it up and say, no, this is to hold pomegranates. It just happens to be a pomegranate holder. Now that I've set up a pomegranate holder, hey, I can happen to pour some wine through it. So I haven't set up a filter from a wine, I've set up a pomegranate holder. Now, this is where Rav Ashi's comment comes in quite helpfully, where he says, well, provided that he holds pomegranates in it first. So it's saying, okay, that's a good, all good and well, but you got to actually put a pomegranate in there. You have to, doing that locks it in its status as a pomegranate holder. And then if you use it for something else, that's fine. And so the first step you get is the concept of the subterfuge, this notion that you're not violating law. And this is an important theme in rabbinic literature. The question is what category does it belong in? Are you violating law or you're not violating law? And this is a kind of a fun way to get at that question. But we learn a lot more in this text. So if we turn to the next slide, the text continues. So how is this case, now they're continuing on talking about straining wine, different from that which is taught in a baraita? A baraita is a text quoted in later rabbinic literature that presumes itself to be from earlier texts. Sometimes it is, sometimes it's not. Sometimes we might not have record of it. Sometimes it's invented. That's a whole other long story that I'm happy to talk about later. But regardless, it's claiming that it's an earlier tradition. One may brew beer on the intermediate days of the festival when it's necessary for drinking on the festival. So let's pause there for a second. It's the Babylonian Talmud. It switches to questions of beer all the time. There's one version of this talk I give where I talk just about beer and why the Babylonian Talmud talks about beer and how you could use Babylonian questions about beer to think about how the Palestinian rabbinic traditions get translated into a Babylonian context. But I'm just going to point out that beer really matters to them. That's the drink that they drink. So when is it necessary for drinking on the festival? So you can brew it on intermediate days, on those days in between beginning and end of Sukkot, beginning and end of Pesach, for brewing beer because when you need it to drink on the festival. But if it is not necessary for drinking on the festival, then it's forbidden because it seems to be the argument it takes away from the sanctity. So this ruling applies to brewing both date beer and barley beer. Even though one has old beer, available festival drinking, one may employ a subterfuge and drink for the newly fresh brewed beer. So you can say, I got some beer in the fridge, but I wanna, I have Vit beer and I want I want a pale ale. You can argue that you want to brew a different beer for that. And you can say, oh, I'm brewing it for the festival and no one's going to check your categories. If we go to the next slide, I want to talk about why it matters. I'm going to finish this text in a second, but I want to talk about why it matters because they bring up date beer and barley beer. Now, the two holidays where intermediate festivals apply are Passover and Sukkot. And Passover, well, barley beer it would be a problem to drink barley beer on Passover because of chametz, because of leaven. Date beer would actually be permissible. And actually there are some microbrewers now that are starting to make date beer, and some that have even tried to do it in regard to Passover for that very reason. And similarly, if you go to the next slide, I highlight this as well. For Sukkot, which is coming up, I just saw that, you might have just missed the deadline for your lulav and etrog, right? Date beer is one of the, dates is one of those things that's that you're seeing pictured right there. So the connections between that, so the two types of beer they talk about, there are different qualities of beer, but it seems not incidental to me that the two types that they mention have resonances with the two holidays that have intermediate festivals. So I also like to point out these little details to students, because the other thing is I still remember learning Talmud I really started learning it in any serious way as an undergrad, and how overwhelming it was, and how many of these little details you don't get unless you know the backstory of things. And so I also like to point out these little details, because I think that a more fluent reader of them would just catch them and not necessarily even articulate them. So then go to the next slide, because we'll finish the text. I then, so it's just highlighting that feature. No, back again. Yes, there. So there, in regard to beer, the subterfuge, the matter is not apparent. Here, in regard to wine, the matter is apparent. And that's another important parsing that they do, right? Where they say with the beer, I don't know how much beer is in your fridge, right? But your wine, I can very clearly see if it's drained or not, if it's strained or not strained. When we looked in that spiced wine, I could see if there were bits and bobs, floating at the top or not. So again, this is working out the categories of what it means. And so in doing this, I have to explain a lot of festival legislation, a lot of Sabbath legislation, through talking about concepts of drinks and drinking, and the ways that these legal categories are sort of set and established. So I want to make sure, how much time am I supposed to speak for again? Because that helps me with pacing. 30, 45?
You have, so right now it is
10:21.
Yeah, you could, the whole thing ends at 11:15. You can leave,
Okay.
20 minutes for Q&A if you want.
Perfect. So let's continue on. Then I'm doing okay on my pacing. Okay. So the next text is when manslaughter is the whole Megillah. You can turn to the next slide. Now, this is one of my favorite passages because the first part is so well known. One more ahead. The first part is so well known, but the second part, which comes immediately after it, is not. And I think that to understand the first part, you need to read the second part. So this is talking about Purim. And I won't ask for show of hands, but I'm pretty sure everyone's heard of the first part of the text, that Rava said, a person is obligated to become intoxicated on Purim until he cannot distinguish between cursed is Haman and blessed is Mordechai. And that part gets cited. I think if I were to walk into pretty much any synagogue on Purim and ask if anyone knew this text, the majority of hands would go up to at least have some knowledge of it. But I don't think many people know what the words that come immediately after it, which is this. Rabbah and Rabbi Zera prepared a Purim meal together. They became intoxicated. Rabbah split the throat of Rabbi Zera. The next day, Rabbah prayed and revived him. And slit the throat is from the same root of shchita, right? He literally severed his whole head off. And the next day, Rabbah prayed and revived him. The following year, Rabbah said to Rabbi Zera, shall master come and we will prepare a Purim meal together? Rabbi Zera said to Rabbah, not every time does a miracle occur, which I think is a great life lesson. If your friend gets really drunk and kills you, and then prays for a miracle to revive you, you might not want to party with him again next year. And I argue that these texts are put together to temper the drinking, because there's a broader rabbinic issue with drinking till intoxication. Right? Barry mentioned earlier about the idea of cutting your wine with water. That was to keep it, prevent it from getting to the point where you get drunk. And by the way, that last line, not every time does a miracle occur, occurs in other texts. And one that's quite relevant to this moment is there are texts that talk about actions during a plague and how one should act. And it talks about being careful in public during times of a plague for that exact reason, that it doesn't reference the story, but it referenced that line. And you want to be careful because not every time does a miracle occur. So this text is, I use it to talk about the rabbinic ideas of drinking for celebration, but also temperance, even at the moment where there's the ad lo yada, until you cannot distinguish idea. There's still a text that I read as tempering that a bit to say, okay, you can let go, but still hold back a bit. So yes, the next text. So now we're going to, and if I'm going too quickly, I'm happy to slow down at some point, but I want to make sure to cover a few things. This is back one more. Yes. Okay, yeah, no, forward one more, sorry, right there. So drinking from a statue and kissing an idol. So now if you go to the next slide, there's a well-known biblical injunction against idolatry, and the rabbis expand it greatly. But they need to define what idolatry is. Idolatry is the polar opposite of Rabbinic Judaism, and it's understood as violating central theological tenets. But the closest thing we find in the Mishnah of a definition of idolatry is this passage that's on the screen. Whether he worships an idol in the manner it is normally worshipped, or sacrifices, or burns incense, or pours a libation, or bows, or accepts it as a god, saying, "You are my God." This is their definition. The one I like the most is at the very end, right? If you accept an idol as your God and say, "You are my God," that's idolatry. I think that that's a pretty clear definition. If you say, I'm an idolater and this is my idol, that's idolatry to me. But this becomes their definition of it. But they have a problem, because if any of you even walked around modern Rome today, you see there are statues everywhere, deities everywhere. And because this is a book about drinking, you'll also see that some of them have water flowing out of their mouths. They're fountains that you can drink from. But can you do that and violate halakha? Or can you do that and not violate halakha? Or is drinking from it a violation of halakha? Well, the answer, if I haven't prepared you enough for this, I know Quinn will know the answer to this, is it depends. So let's look at the next slide where we start to, so first, that's the biblical injunction, you shall not bow down to them, and then the next slide. Okay, let's start. Now we're in Tractate Avodah Zarah, which is a tractate on idolatry. So we begin. A spring that flows out of a temple of idolatry. So there's a temple of idolatry and it has a nice freshwater spring that you can get some water out of. You're thirsty. One should not bend down in front of it and drink, because it will appear as if one bows to an idol. Okay, so you're facing the temple, you bow down to get a drink, it will appear as if you're bowing to the idol. That's a no-no. But one may turn his back and drink it. So you can, if you're facing it, it looks like you're bowing to it. The other way, it looks like you're mooning it, I guess. So that's not. And in a place where one is not seen, it is permissible. So if you're not to be seen, one could do either. The idea being, if you did it with intentionality, that's idolatry. If you do it because you want to drink, it's not idolatry, but it could be viewed as idolatrous, so therefore you can't do it. So you can turn your back. But if no one sees you, this is another example of it depends. So if I were to ask you, can you bow facing a temple and drink from a spring? The answer is it depends. If you mean to do it as an act of idolatry, no. If no one can see you, yes. If someone can see you, but you don't mean it as an act of idolatry, no. So this is, again, to do this, and this is where it gets to the introduction to themes, I'm explaining to students, and maybe I'm assuming too much, tell me if I am, but I'm not gonna slow down and explain every little inner outer detail of this, because I'm assuming some more basic knowledge on the part of this audience. You're assuming that, so you have to explain idolatry, what that means, why the rabbis are so against it, what the biblical injunctions are, and working through those variables. So now, if you turn to the next slide, we get to another really interesting variable, where I call it kissing an idol. So on the bottom right is a statue, well-known fountain in Orange Park in Rome. And this is the kind of statue that they're thinking of when they talk about this text. Scriptures of faces that sprout water in the cities. Well, that's a sculpture of a face that spouts water in the city in Rome. So they certainly, I don't think this exact statue was there at that time, but many statues like it would have been around. One may not place his mouth on the mouth of a sculpture and drink because it will appear as if one kisses an idol. So that would be seen as an act of veneration. You cannot put your mouth to it. Public health would also suggest not a good idea to put your mouth onto any sort of water fountain and drink directly from it, right? Especially during COVID-19 times. But one may collect water in his hand and drink. So you can put your hands out, let it fall into your hand and drink, because then it's clearly showing that you're not doing that veneration. Further, they said one may not place his mouth on the mouth of a pipe and drink because of mortal danger. And by the way, don't put your mouth on that, on any sort of pipe and drink out of it, which seems like just general good advice anyway. If you don't know what a pipe is, don't just stick your mouth on it and drink. And to just clarify that, I'll turn to the next text. The Babylonians, they're really concerned with, right before this. What is the danger? A leech. The Babylonian Talmud goes on to talk a lot about leeches, but they understand it very concretely as a leech. So this is an example again of how texts about drinking lead you to talk about, so why about drinking? Because it leads you to talk about all these other things. I have to talk about idolatry and other things. So now, since you turn to the next slide, let's do that, because this has become my favorite passage to talk about. I think this resonates with lots of age groups, but particularly with our undergraduate learners, because this is one of the ones that I just happened to come at because I wanted to do a chapter on ritual purity. And I'll be honest, I've avoided writing as much as possible, even though food connects with it, on purity and impurity, because I have colleagues who work on that, and God bless them, because I find it to be boring. And I hope there's not a strike of lightning right now. But I find these texts important, but boring to work through all these details. So I've avoided it. I couldn't avoid it for this because it's such a central, important part. So I was trying to find some interesting texts. And lo and behold, I found this text that talks through the halakha of what to do when your drunk friend pushes you in a river. And I found that that is a better way to introduce people. If I said to you, who would like me to talk about the rules of ritual purity and impurity with regard to liquids that may or may not transmit impurity from a liquid to another person, for example? I don't think many of you would. But if I said, hey, who wants to learn the rabbinic law about what to do when your drunk friend pushes you in a river? Probably more of you are willing to listen. So guess what? I'm going to answer that question. So if we turn to the next slide, start with Mishnah Machshirim. Oh, sorry. Yeah, there we go. Mishnah Machshirim. This is the same tract tip, by the way, that I referenced earlier with regard to talking first about male breast milk and then female breast milk. So if one immersed himself into a river, and there was before him another river, and he crossed through it, the second river's water purifies the first river's water. Okay, so this is a great example. I have to explain a lot to get to that. And again, I hope I'm getting this right. Each time I present this, I'm afraid that I'm going to mess it, like the thing that I thought I understood, I'm going to mess up again or not understand it anymore. So feel free to ask me questions about this, but know that I'll be in trepidation about this. But I keep presenting about it because I think it's so fascinating. So the basic idea is this. If you want to immerse in a river, and you know that river to bathe, so there's intentionality here. So you bathe in a river, and that river has, and that river is not in the status of machshirin. And machshirin is basically a liquid that can transmit liquid. Imagine that like it makes it sticky. It's as if instead of, if I were to take a plain wall and try and put a magnet to it, it wouldn't stick. But if I were to paint on magnetic paint, it would stick, right? So this concept is, does impurity stick and then therefore transfer? Is that stickiness like pollen on a bee going to transfer? So if the first river you intended to go into, right, it's not in that status. So you're not worried about that water. But now you have to go into another river to get home. You have to skip across the river to get home. That river's in that status. Sorry, see, I'm already messing it up. So, if the first river, the one that you bathed in, is in that status of machshirin, and now you're going to go through another river to go home. See, already I'm messing this up because I had that long thing about not messing up. So the first river is in the status of makshirim. So it's sticky, right? Now you're going to cross through a second river's water. The second river purifies the first, which means you have to cross through that river so it gets off that. So you've now replaced whatever water was on you that was sticky, that transfers it, and you've put new water. Okay, so in that case, you're immersed in a river, you had it. If you were to not cross another river, all the water on you can stick impurity and transfer. In the second river, if you cross through a second river and that's not in that status, that replaces it and you're fine. Now we're going to get to the thing that I want to talk about. If his drunk friend pushed him into a river post-immersion, and likewise, the second river's water purifies the first water. Likewise, his animal, the second river's water purifies the first. Now, this is important. If your drunk friend pushes you in. Now, what I imagine, which maybe you've seen this, maybe you've been this or been involved in this. A drunk friend goes over to put their arm around someone and knocks them into a river. Because that was unintentional, the water purifies that person. He didn't mean to go into that water. But if the drunk friend pushes around while horsing around, meaning they go and say, oh, I'm going to knock my friend over and push him in, it doesn't. Why? It quotes this verse from Leviticus, but if water is put upon. Now here the rabbis presume that you've memorized the Hebrew Bible. This is one of my favorite and least favorite parts of rabbinic literature, right? They assume that you've memorized the Hebrew Bible, so they'll quote a passage, and sometimes they won't even quote the part that you need to know to understand the verse. But in this case, and if you go to the next slide, actually, I'll work through this passage quickly for the Leviticus. It's the Leviticus passage that comes from Leviticus 11:38. I'm sure you've all memorized Leviticus 11:34 to 38 because you love to memorize your texts about impurities and purities. But if water is put upon the seed, it is impure for you. And what the rabbis interpret this to mean, it says, is there's intentionality. If water is put upon with intentionality, it is impure for you. And it's this last part that helps you understand it. So they're saying if it's intentional, impurity matters. So if we go back to the next slide, I go back to the text. The intentionality matters here. The intentionality of going in for something will transfer it. So does water transmit this impurity? It depends on your intentionality here. If you meant to go into that water to bathe, it does. If you're just crossing the river, it doesn't. And therefore, it changes the status. If your drunk friend pushes you in because he's drunk and there's no intentionality there, that status does not connect. And if the drunk friend was horsing around, but so therefore intended to push you in, then and I see a question at what point, what was that, Quinn? At what point does it become intentional? What if the drunk friend decides to wrestle or something, but knocks them down to the river? They were intentional and goofy. So it's a good question, and it needs to be spelled out. One of the things that you need to look at is also what it says. So it says this, but it doesn't explain it there. And this is what subsequent rabbinic literature is going to have to come to and explain. This is an interesting thing. Another interesting feature about rabbinic literature is you look and say, oh, this is spelling some variables out, but you see how many variables aren't spelled out. What is intentional? What is not? And if the friend wasn't drunk, for example, if your sober friend just goes to say hello and trips and knocks you in versus meant to push you in. Sober people push people into rivers intentionally and unintentionally too, right? It doesn't spell all that out. But Mishnah begins this discussion of it. And again, I find this to be a much more interesting way to get into impurity than other ways. Because now we're talking, even in your question, Quinn, you're getting to questions of intentionality and ritual purity and impurity. But we're talking again still about how drunk is your friend? What did they mean? All these other matters. And by the way, I've left it aside, but we can also talk about animals here and how that functions. That's another interesting variable. Are there any questions specifically about this? I could pause for a second before I go to, I think, what would be the last text of this moment.
The only other question, I'm not sure that it's particularly relevant to this, was did the rabbis influence Roman law or vice versa? So I don't know if you want to take that at the end.
I'll quickly answer that this way. Very little evidence of rabbis influencing Roman law. Tons of evidence of Roman law influencing the rabbis. If you look at rabbinic legal collections from Roman Palestine, Mishnah, Tosefta, Yerushalmi, and specifically, there are tons of examples of rabbinic case law, even often following models of Roman case law. And same thing with Babylonian Talmud, Babylonian case law and others affecting it. So little example of rabbis influencing Roman law, but lots of examples of Roman law affecting rabbinic law.
Jordan, I do have another question pertinent here. Why does the pusher's intent matter while the inadvertent bather's intent doesn't matter?
Well, in both cases, in some ways, are parallel, because if you intended to go in the river, so if this, the idea is the first one, he intends to go in the first river for the purposes of bathing. The crossing the river makes his intent seen as a secondary intention. So same thing with the drunk friend. The drunk friend, jostling a friend just because they're drunk is seen as a secondary intention, like they mean to give their friend a hug and they knock them over. Whereas the drunk friend horsing around is seen as a primary intent. So there actually is a parallel there. And the problem with intentionality is intentionality matters in rabbinic literature, except when it doesn't. And sometimes intentionality matters more or less, or even if you intended it, the penalty is the same. So, but this is an example where intentionality does matter.
Okay. And one more question.
Yeah.
Or actually, it's a question on purity. Are we talking about ritual purity for participation in the sanctuary?
Okay. So yeah, it's important to because there are theories of all sorts of different purities: ritual impurity for a sanctuary, moral impurity, etc. Yes, they're talking about ideas of ritual purity for times when you would need to be ritually pure. And that could be for sanctuary or times of prayer and such. This is, the thing is, being impure isn't necessarily a bad thing. It happens, it just happens through life, right? Like taking a bath does it, but it can be undone. It just needs to be undone in certain ways before one takes certain ritual actions. Now, by the time of the Mishnah, it's post Second Temple, so it's theoretical, right? It's not for temple sacrifice, but it becomes then read into rabbinic prayer. And then what's that question about but the bather is just as forced by the river by the need. Well, but the question here is intent. The bather intended to go into the river for the purposes of getting wet, and the bather did not intend to go into the river, the second river, for the purpose of getting wet. The bather intended to go into the second. And by the way, now if you zoom out, notice this again is why I love talking about liquids and beverages, because I see them as connecting to so many other things. You also see a broader rabbinic category of first versus secondary. Let's look at the river. And this comes up, for example, in Sabbath cooking law, right? Kli Rishon versus Kli Sheni, like cooking in a first vessel versus second. So if you want to make tea, right? Pouring hot water into on Sabbath, pouring hot water into one vessel, then putting the tea in the second vessel and pouring the water into it, because cooking only occurs in the first vessel. Same thing here. The second thing is seen as incidental. And as long as you're not saying, I'm going into this river for the purpose of getting wet, say I'm going into the second river for the purpose of just getting home quickly. Now, all of these categories, the other thing to point out, we're talking about Mishnah, and even in the Talmud, you get this. Other thing to say is these categories don't always neatly work. And that's why, as much as it's the bane of my existence, medieval codes come along. I always say, whenever I have to, in a class, switch, we're talking about the classical rabbis to medieval Judaism, and I have friends who are medievalists, but it always makes me very sad, because I find the medieval period very boring, because that's when you move towards codes, where instead of this open-ended discussion where they're still figuring things out and things are still murky, they move to, okay, what are the three laws in order? and let's ignore all of the rich, complicated debate. I just want to know the answer, right? And in some ways, it's like the student who comes in and says, I don't care about this fascinating discussion, what's going to be on the final. I just need to know the one question in the final. And that's the medievalist. So if there are any medievalists out there, I'm sorry, but I'm right. So let's move on to the last text. Shouldn't take too long. Quickly, we'll say, Torah brightens the face, and then move to the next one, which is, this is from, I wanted to make sure also I had a text from the Yerushalmi. I've talked about the Babylonian Talmud. This is the Jerusalem Talmud. And also to talk about another, we talked about Purim as a drinking festival. The other drinking holiday is Passover, right? And Passover, the rabbinic category of binge drinking is 1 cup of uncut wine or 4 cups of wine mixed with water. And on Passover, you're supposed to drink 4 cups. So it fills the rabbinic definition of binge drinking. And the rabbis have a concept that you shouldn't drink pairs of beverages. So 3 cups are good, 4 are bad. So this is a problem. And there are texts that they work through that. One of my favorite examples of how rabbis would avoid that, I just can't resist saying this, is there was a rabbi whose mother would come to him, to the bar with him. And she would always hold 2 cups in her hands so that he would have 1. So no matter what, she'd make sure that he always ended on an odd number, not an even number. Because if you end on an odd number, then witches and demons can attack you. So I just love the image of a mother hovering over her child in the bar. You know, here, boy chick, don't, I don't want you to get attacked by demons. So let's look at this text. Rabbi Yehuda Rabbi Yehuda Bei Rabbi Elai drank the 4 cups of Passover night and bandaged his head until the festival of Shavuot. He had a raging hangover from Passover to Shavuot. A 50-day hangover sounds pretty bad. So he couldn't handle his 4 cups. Exactly, 4 cups are pairs. There's if you read the book Rabbinic Drinking, available at all fine sellers now, you'll find that they have fascinating ways of doing this. One is they basically redo the math and say, well, it's 3 cups plus 1 is one way to do it. So it's not 4, it's 3 and 1. So they do math the way I do math, which is why I'm not a mathematician. The other Jordan's the mathematician, but they find ways to reparse that. I see, there we go. I see the other Jordan has chimed in with, although I still maintain we have a debate of who's the other Jordan. I'm publicly stating I'm the other Jordan. So a certain matron saw him with his face slit up. So he's hungover. And then a certain matron, which is code word for a Roman non-Jewish woman, saw him with her face lit up. She said to him, old man, you are one of 3 things. Either you're a wine drinker, or you're a lender on interest, or you're a pig breeder. So there's a few things I'll say for that. Old man, is a phrase that can mean like old man, literally, or it can also mean Tana, and he was a Tana, the first group of rabbis, so it has a nice little pun. So she sees him happy and says, there are only 3 things you must be. And each of them are problematic. A wine drinker, meaning you're a drunkard, right? And that's a concern because I've talked before about the idea of temperance, not being drunk. A lender on interest or a pig breeder. Now I want to talk quickly about these other 2. So if you'll turn to the next slide, what's the problem with lending on interest? It's barred biblically, but also I found this fascinating text from Talmud, the Tosefta Bava Metzia. It says, usurers declare the Torah a fraud and Moses a fool. And they say, if Moses would have known how profitable we would be, he never would have written the prohibition against usury. This is a fascinating text, right? That's saying that if they knew how much money you could make, right? They'd say, Moses, if you'd known this, you never would have written that. So their one concern of usury is that, declaring that problem. And then if you turn to the next slide. This is when I'm kind of sad because I've spent this whole summer focused on admin duties and prepping for teaching. And so usually I spend the summer working on my next project. And my next project is going to be about Jews and the pig. But this is the closest I've come all summer to working on that, is this one slide that we're talking about now. So it says in Mishnah Bava Kama, Jews may not raise pigs anywhere. There's another text that says Jews may not raise pigs on the land of Israel. And it's fascinating because there's a a modern kibbutz that built a wooden platform 1 foot off the ground and then would raise pigs there because they said, well, we're not raising pigs on the land of Israel. And I think that's actually a wonderful rabbinic workaround because you're not, again, that's a subterfuge, right? I'm not actually violating the law. And then I have the Baxter, the pig who wanted to be kosher, which PJ Library sent for my child. And I read him a couple times, but then I hid it away because I count that as research. You know, I want to use that in this project. I also, fascinatingly, I'll just say this one last thing about this. My mother, who claims she never pressured us to have kids, right? I found out when I told her that Val was pregnant that she, for years, had been hiding away a set of Hebrew blocks, and they had all sorts of different animals on them. And then my wife grew up in Italy, so I ordered the same pair in Italian, and I found that they had all the same animals pretty much, except the Italian blocks had a pig, and the Hebrew blocks did not. Although the Hebrew blocks had other equally non-kosher animals, the eagle, so they had Nesha, they had the camel. I mean, the camel is the same verses that kick pig out, kick camel out, but it's the baggage of the legacy of pig as a cultural legal issue that comes out in children's blocks, and Baxter, the pig who wants to be kosher. So let's turn back to that text in the next slide. And then he says to her, may that woman's breath expire. He literally is saying, drop dead, stop breathing. I am none of these things. Rather, my learning is within me, for it is written, the wisdom of a person brightens his face. Meaning I'm smiling, not because I'm drunk, not because I made a quick shekel lending money, and not because I make business selling chazer, selling pig. Rather, it's because Torah makes me so happy, even though I'm hungover for 50 days. So, the next slide, the next slide should actually set everything up nicely, which is, what questions do you have? This was a picture that someone found for a talk I gave, and I liked, but we couldn't get the rights to it, which is why the cover of my book has wine stains on the cover. I actually like the cover much better, but I thought this was a very striking image. So, questions?
There is one posted there. Why do we focus on the letter of the law versus the intent of the law?
Well, it depends. Sometimes we focus on the intent of the law and sometimes we focus on the letter. What I would start with to say is you focus on the letter of the law because in all legal systems, the question is, did a tort occur or did it not? You know, the example I give to students is one person walks up to another person and punches them in the face. Is that assault? And I'm not a modern American lawyer, but the answer is it depends. I have to ask you some questions, right? Are they in a boxing match that's sanctioned and legally signed off on? Right? There's a whole series of questions we could ask. My wife delights whenever there's a mosquito on my body, so she can rear back and it was just a mosquito, right? And I trust her; it always is. I'm sure she would never make that up. So the first question is the letter of the law, but intent can sometimes get to that, right? So and this matters too. Like, did you mean to break the law? And this comes down to I was recording a lecture for my students the other day, and I talk about the Bible doesn't say thou shalt not kill. It says thou shalt not murder, because murder is intended unjustified homicide, right? Manslaughter, intent matters. It reduces culpability. So intent does matter, except when it doesn't, right? So this is again, and maybe this is a chicken or the egg thing. I'm not sure if I was always the kind of person who was totally fine with ambiguity, or spending years studying ambiguous text made me even more comfortable with it. But I think that embracing that, you actually learn a tremendous amount about the text and about the ways of thinking. So it doesn't, oh yes, I could have talked about breast milk too. I'm happy to. Okay, so very quick is why breast milk matters. We talked about purity. Let me give a quick example of this. The rabbis believed, like ancient Greeks and Romans, like Galen, a famous Greek physician, like Tertullian, like Aristotle, like modern Western medicine until the 17th century or so, that breast milk was transformed menstrual blood. because they viewed them as pretty unique liquids to females, and that they viewed, before you could go to Walgreens at 24 hours and get a fast test, right? The cessation of menstrual blood was a pretty reliable indicator. And then postpartum, the onset of menstruation, again, usually coincides with a reduction in production of breast milk. So there seems to be some empirical notion to that. You could imagine if you didn't know the kinds of things that now we know via Wikipedia and modern science, you might come to a different conclusion. So blood is the most tabooed bodily liquid in the Hebrew Bible, and menstrual blood is the most tabooed of the most tabooed. So then what do they do with that? And it's also the normative figures in rabbinic literature are adult rabbinic Jewish men. And breast milk is produced by and for non-normative figures, right? It's produced by women for infants. And for a brief period of time, it is vital to life, because prior to, people can debate now, breast is best versus formula, but it's only been the past 100, 150 years that we had formula as an option, right? You could debate, is your child going to get into Dartmouth or Princeton, but it's not, will your child live or die? Prior to the past 150 years, you had three options: the biological mother breastfed, a wet nurse breastfed, or the child passed away. And just that, and so the stakes are very different for that. And so they work through that. And one last thing I'll say about this that I find fascinating is once I was going to give a talk on this in a synagogue that I will not name, that's not this synagogue, so I'll say that, talk about, and an older gentleman said, I'm a grandfather. Well, that's a woman's issue. I don't want to talk about that. And I was like, well, I reject that on few premise. Number one, if you're a grandfather, you've had kids and grandkids. And number two, my entire argument is going to be that breastfeeding is actually a male issue in rabbinic literature. It's not a women's issue. And one of the key examples is I bring this up in regard to marriage, because the rabbis have a principle that a biological father is required to feed his own child. A wife is obligated to feed her husband's child. Were they to get divorced, the biological mother has no rabbinic obligation to feed her own child. So that becomes an issue of contract law then, actually, because she's no longer contractually obligated to her husband, and she has no obligation to her own child. Now, they work around that by saying that if the child recognizes the mother, which child will very quickly, studies show this, then he pays her basically like a wet nurse. So he contracts the biological mother is then treated legally as a wet nurse. And so this is why I was starting to see all of these themes in rabbinic literature. I have to talk about gender and sexuality. I have to talk about contract law, right? I have to talk about marriage. I have to talk about purity and impurity, etc.
And you might also need to talk about this. There was a follow-up comment when we were before we switched to the topic of breast milk about how much Jews like workarounds, that we can't carry on Shabbat, but if you run a fish wire around the community, you can carry. Well, that's going to open a whole other can of worms. But if you want to bring it back to rabbinic drinking, I challenge you to do that.
Sure. I mean, no, but that's exactly the question, right? But so. The negative way is, oh, you look for the workarounds. But what I'm also trying to get students to see, and to push back against what becomes a common anti-Semitic trope unto today, is instead of viewing that as an overly legalistic, hard-headed, wrong-minded, non-spiritual people, I want my students to see, I'm trying to explain why I love this literature, why I fell down this rabbit hole as an undergrad and never left college. Right? I spent 11 years in undergrad and grad, and I'm entering my 13th year now at UW. So it's 24 years of my life that I don't believe is wasted, most of it. I mean, we're going to ignore a couple of years here or there, but most of it's not wasted. And certainly it's not wasted because I've made plenty of poor life choices, but I think devoting my life to the Talmud wasn't one of them. Unless me not realizing that it's a poor life choice, but we'll leave that aside. But for them, that really matters. Like, so they're talking about these esoteric, weird things. So you say the Eruv, right? It's a piece of string around a wire. What does that do? Well, what you're also doing is you're saying that this is my community for the point of this is you cannot go to the domain and outside your community. And this is a way of drawing a boundary of community. So you can look at it negatively, or you can say, look, the question is do you violate law or not? And a workaround is a way to not violate law. And anyone who's filled out their taxes, I mean, I actually love talking to my tax person. Apparently, I'm the most excited person of the people that she works with. I'm happy to recommend her. She's phenomenal. But I just love to talk about taxes because I remember being a grad student and there was like one piece of paper I had to fill out and I had to do it myself. And now I have all these questions because wait, can this count? Can that count? Can I deduct my passport? Can I do this? And it's the rabbinic mindset for that. But same thing with tax code, right? Is this, and I often say to her, I don't want to do anything gray. I want to do what's black and white in law. And I'm amazed at what is that. And it's all sorts of workaround. If you can, anyone in his taxes, right? You can there are 3 ways to do something. And if you do it this way, you can deduct more than if you do it that way, but they're equally allowable. Now, if that's great because it saves me a shekel, that's one thing. If I'm doing it because I believe that I don't want to violate God's law, so I take that seriously, that's step 1. And I actually find it enjoyable, step 2. And B, one of the things that replaces sacrifice in the temple, it's prayer and study. And the study is exactly this. So the act of parsing that out is seen as tantamount to sacrifice.
So, do you see the question about drinking and drunkenness?
Which one about drunk? I just saw Jordan Ellenberg say, as an Orthodox guy, do my taxes.
But there's a question before that.
It seems that drinking and drunkenness is pretty much accepted. Actually, the opposite. Though, so I chose to highlight the text that So first of all, it's very. We'll begin with the Purim text. The point of that is, it's actually. People are, my argument is they're quoting the wrong text. Everyone wants to quote Ad lo yada because it's fun. Wants to talk about, I have to be, Debbie Downer over here to then say, okay, well, right after they talk about what happens if you let go of control too much. The rabbis, by and large, are more interested in temperance, in not drinking too much. That doesn't mean not drinking. It means not drinking to excess. And so it's much more common. I've chose the 2 examples, but even those, the rabbi who drinks too much only drinks 4 cups of wine at Passover, right? He doesn't drink more than that amount. There are texts that embrace that. There's a rabbi who, to get hungry for matzah, gets drunk. He pre-games the entire, which is a concept I think is familiar to many of my undergrads, spends the entire day leading up to the eve of Passover not eating matzah, but getting drunk on wine, so that when it comes time to eat wine, he's going to eat matzah, he's going to eat it with gusto. But if you put those on a scale, the texts about temperance far outweigh them. And even the texts about getting drunk have concerns about that. Was wine stronger in rabbinic times, or can they just not hold their liquor? Depends on the person. But wine probably was weaker for a variety of things, because there's a long history of improvement of quality of wine and quality standards of wine that I actually delved into just to learn about it for background for things. But wine today, your average $2 chuck is going to be more potent than your average ancient wine. But you could still get drunk on both, or so I've been told. I can neither confirm nor deny.
I don't see any other questions coming in on the chat.
Gwen had actually done something earlier that said only
Yes.
if you ran out of material. She was bringing up something about the tofu model.
Oh, Quinn, yeah. Quinn, what were you saying about the tofu model? What did you say about that? Of course, Quinn would bring up the tofu model. That's something I talk about in
Everything
in
around
class.
influences Judaism, like how
Yes.
how tofu takes on flavor.
Yes, yeah. So this is one of my shticks. Is in Intro to Judaism, I talk about the tofu model, which is I reject essentialism in the sense of I don't think there's an essential characteristic of Judaism. I was talking to a colleague about this. They were talking about what categories do you use today. They're talking about Jews, white Jews, quote unquote, Jews of color, etc. And I said, I want to actually begin by expanding what the category of Jew is, because I think a lot of these categories have a very Ashken normative white definition of Judaism. And I'd say I would actually first want to say you need to expand the category. Before you talk about the finer nuances, you have to talk about the larger category. The same way if you have to refer to a man who's a nurse as a male nurse, it means a lack of imagination of the category of nurse and what you've defaulted to as the normative and the way you've gendered that. So I would begin that. And then what I then say is like tofu, it might have a texture, but it doesn't have a flavor. Now texture, I say, is the texts and traditions that a given community inherits. It inherits Bible, it inherits Mishnah or Talmud, and how it understands it, but it takes on the flavor of where it's at. And that could be in the food. Look at the menu for this, right, is trying to show foods that connect to things that would be available and in the world around it. And same thing with this. And this is a perfect example of that is Jews in Babylonia are going to ask about beer. So a text that I didn't talk about here, thank you, J.Z. Pollock, for the call out for the Ashken normative. So I guess 5 points for Gryffindor for that one. But a text I didn't talk about, but I sometimes talk about, is the Mishnah has a separate blessing for wine. Grape, if you have a grape, it's one blessing, wine another, right? An apple or an apple juice doesn't get the same categorical distinction. Wine has its own blessing. Wine becomes for Kiddush and Havdalah. It's not to the Bavli that they ask question like, okay, can you use beer for Havdalah? Can you use beer for Kiddush? It's not a question you would ask in Roman Palestine. But in Bavel, you would. And the answer, it gets complicated, it depends. One rabbi eventually says, well, beer is the wine of this region. It seems to be that wine is much more problematic for Kiddush than Havdalah. But what that shows is it's taking on the flavor of around it. So instead of saying what's the Jewish perspective on this, it gets to Jews, different groups live in different places at different times and have different experiences, and they draw on some set of principles. So with regard to food, what is Jewish food? It depends on what time and place. It's drawing on the things that are around it with some concessions for kashrut, but not always. I mean, in America, people talk about the Reuben as being a quintessential Jewish sandwich. And the Reuben, depending on the origin, myth, and style, violates one or more definitions of kashrut that I'm aware of. So, but is it Jewish? And that depends on what you want to define for things. So if wine is handled by non-Jews, must be v'sham. Okay, great question about, okay, so wine, there's a scholar, Sasha Stern, refers to this concern of that non-Jews are what he calls compulsive libationers.
Jordan, can you ask that question so everyone
Sure.
can hear?
So if wine is handled by non-Jews, must it be mivushal for some? Does beer have similar limits? So mivushal, is it cooked? And this concern comes with wine. You have a concern that a non-Jew they can't resist it. They will take the wine and pour it out as a libation to a deity. And the Mishnah Avodah Zarah says you can't leave a non-Jew alone in a wine shop for enough time for them to run over, open up a hole in a wine jug, let a little pour out for a deity, and quickly seal it back up. So there's this deep concern about that. And there's this concern that is completely unattested in non-rabbinic literature, that if you cook wine, it's not suitable for pagan libation. There's no proof of that. In fact, I thought I was going to write a nice article about that, and then realized that actually medieval rabbis have, they got to me first and said, yeah, it's totally made up. The rabbis made it up, but that's the ruling. So it becomes a categorical thing. And to this day, if wine is not mivushal, if wine has not been cooked for that status, if you go to a wedding and they're kosher servers, it's supposed to be a kosher wedding, a non-Jewish wine steward could not pour the wine unless it's mivushal, because that would technically be them handling the wine. So the mivushal locks it in that status. It's like putting the pomegranate in the strainer. It locks it in the status. Beer doesn't have that concern. And my favorite text about this, which I didn't get to, is they say, okay, wine is a problem. We know because of idolatry. What about beer? And this is in the Babylonian Talmud. And they say, why is beer prohibited to drink? And they say, mishum chatanut, because of intermarriage. So they give an example where you could go to a Gentile tavern, order Gentile beer made by Gentiles, and as long as you drink it outside the bar, it's kosher. And they say one rabbi, Rav Papa, would wait and have them serve it right outside the bar and then he'd drink it because it's the social situation that's not kosher. Another rabbi was more machmir and he'd wait till he got home. Now, this is also an example, I love to bring it up because Rav Papa's become my favorite rabbi because he made a fortune as a brewer, as a microbrewer. And if you look at several laws like this one, he happens to always be the most lenient with regard to beer or add, well, you can drink beer for this. And if you're the CEO of a beer company and you're changing rabbinic law to allow for leniencies with regard to beer, we might call that a conflict of interest. But yeah, so that status does not affect, and they acknowledge it, but it's the social situation. And this is a text I've written about a decent amount because it's a great example of how kashrut is not just about food status. It's about also the status of the situation. And this, by the way, comes up, there's a modern case in Israel in the 80s of a wedding venue that was certified kosher by the chief rabbinate, but they would allow a belly dancer to work at weddings. And the chief rabbinate tried to revoke its hashgacha, its kosher certification. And it went before the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled it was actually an overreach because it wasn't about, were you serving fish that is not certified kosher. And so they said that its legal authority they were overreaching their legal authority and therefore they could not revoke kosher certification because of that.
I'm not entirely sure what Hank's comment is getting at there.
It's not a conflict of interest, it's talking his book.
Hank, you want to elaborate?
Rav Papa, well, there's actually a series of rabbis. It's an article that, unfortunately, I won't have the time, that one day when COVID allows it. What? Yeah, okay. I'll just quickly say there's an article I want to write that when COVID allows it, that I found that it's not just Rav Papa. There's at least one or two other rabbis one rabbi also changes legislation with regard to beer, and another rabbi says, oh, he's only saying that because he's just invested in a beer business and he's making money off of it. And then they kind of laugh and move on. And no one, and it's I want to write a broader article because I think it's an interesting insight into when economic interests and halachic interests intertwine and how they deal with that. This is also an example I bring up in my book because I want to say you have to know a little bit about the history of some of these figures, just as we would in other things. If you see a politician arguing for something and their backstory, and oh, of course so-and-so is going to want the law to change for that, right? Of course so-and-so who owns a pass-through business is going to want to change the law to the tax code to allow for pass-through businesses, for example. The same thing should influence, and it also humanizes them. One of the things that I find is students, I love these figures because they're so human in many ways, but if you're unfamiliar with these texts, you tend to put them on a pedestal, but at these moments, their humanity comes out and their give and take as humans comes through this text. So any other questions? Be interested in Zooming a class. Right now, so I usually am very open to auditors, right? I will talk about it for next semester. This semester, I'm trying to, someone asked me about auditors. I'm trying to not do that because there are so many, it's sort of white knuckling with all of the technology and technological issues. I'm just trying to reduce variables. But next semester, I'm going to be more confident in that. And I'm betting on next semester still being an online semester. But certainly when it's in person, I love auditors. And next semester, I should have a better handle on it. This semester, I'm just trying to make it all work.
Amazing. Whether you are the or the other Jordan.
I'm the other Jordan. I've stated it publicly.
It was a fascinating topic and presentation for bringing back Kolot Kehilla to all of us after nearly 9 months. Actually, we had a youngest, like 1-year-old listening in, and we also had the farthest was Judith Kornblatt from Israel. So.
Oh, and my coworker, I think that he is. He can. The deal was if he gave some quiet and peace for that, his mother would do an overly complicated craft project with him. The fact that he hasn't interrupted means that he probably convinced her to do a really overly complicated craft project, because he's the one who's like, so when all the scientists stop working on COVID, could they get to this alien DNA transformation device that I saw in a cartoon, and could they make it real? And can we maybe make that out of cardboard, but I want it to work?
Beautiful. So just so everybody knows, we have also recorded the presentation and can make it available for you. And if you missed the first 15 minutes of the schmooze, and Adrienne Borsi and Barry Rich, who also pulled all of this together with Jordan Rosenblum, and we thank you both. They did a kind of showing of all of the menu foods from the recipes that they cooked everything. So thank you, Jordan. Thank you, everybody who came on. It was a great showing, and it was a lot of fun.
And if anyone ever has more questions, you know where to find me. I'll be in my basement.
And we all survived the power surge this morning. Have a great Labor Day weekend, you guys.
Thank you, Jordan.
Thank you.